Ever wonder what it really means to be human? I mean, beyond the whole walking upright thing, appreciating a good cup of coffee, what makes us us?
It's a question for the ages, isn't it?
It really is. And luckily for us, we've got some fascinating insights from anthropology to help us unpack it. We're diving into small places, large issues today. It's an introduction to social and cultural anthropology. And let me tell you, this book is already challenging some deeply held assumptions.
Oh, absolutely. From the very first pages, it kind of throws you for a loop, doesn't it?
It does. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about what makes us tick.
Well, it starts right off with this whole idea that we aren't born fully human, at least not in a cultural sense.
Right, the whole feral children thing. Kids raised in complete isolation from human contact.
Exactly. Now, these stories, they're often fictionalized, kind of like cautionary tales, but they highlight something really crucial about human development.
That we're not just pre-programmed robots. There's more to it than our biology.
Exactly. We become human through social interaction. It's like learning a language or table manners. We learn how to be human.
So it's not just about nature, it's about nurture.
It's both. It's both nature and de-nurture and the amazing ways they intertwine. But what's fascinating is how culture, that nurture part, that social environment, really provides the software for our human experience.
Okay, so walk me through this. How does culture actually shape us? Give me an example.
Well, let's take something as basic as eating, right? Seems pretty natural, doesn't it?
Sure, we all gotta eat.
Right. But think about food taboos. Hindus avoiding meat, Jewish and Muslim restrictions on pork, even the modern rise of veganism. These aren't just individual choices. They're deeply ingrained cultural values that dictate what we put in our bodies.
So something we might consider a personal preference is actually influenced by, what, centuries of cultural programming?
Precisely. It's mind-blowing, isn't it?
It really is. So how does this all tie back to the nature versus nurture debate?
Well, that's where the book's Four Dimensions of Human Existence diagram comes in. It's basically saying, look, who we are is a mix of our biology, our genes, and our social environment.
So a recipe with both nature and nurture as key ingredients.
Exactly. And anthropology focuses on that vast spectrum of how humans develop within our biological limits. Our genes, they provide a framework, but within that, culture plays an incredibly powerful role.
So to put it another way, while our biology might give us the stage and the lighting, it's culture that writes the script, directs the actors, and determines what kind of play unfolds.
Now, that's a great analogy. And to highlight this even further, the book delves into the concept of race. Genetically speaking, the actual DNA differences between racial groups, it's minuscule.
Minuscule how? Like, give me a number.
0.012%. That's it.
0.012%. So the difference between me and someone from a completely different background is basically, I don't know, the difference between a poppy seed bagel and a sesame seed bagel.
Okay, I love that. And you're right, it highlights how small those differences really are. Anthropology views race as a social construct, not some biological reality. It's about how societies categorize and assign meaning to these tiny, often arbitrary differences.
And those social constructs have very real consequences, right? It's not just about bagel toppings. It's about how those perceived differences lead to prejudice, discrimination, and systemic inequalities.
Exactly. It's about understanding that race, while not grounded in biology, is a powerful social idea with very real and often tragic consequences. And this leads us to another key concept in understanding the socially constructed self: statuses and roles.
Okay, unpack that for me. I think we all have an understanding of roles, like we play different parts in our daily lives, but what's the anthropological take on this?
Right. Well, anthropologists argue that we're all actors on a social stage, constantly navigating different statuses and roles. Each status, whether it's parent, employee, friend, podcast listener, it comes with its own set of expectations, behaviors, even ways of speaking.
And we shift between these roles effortlessly, depending on the situation.
Yeah.
It's incredible when you think about it, how we just adapt.
Yeah.
But does that make us inauthentic in a way? Are we all just putting on a performance?
Ooh, that's where things get really interesting.
So are we just putting on a performance? Like, deep down, is there even such a thing as an authentic self? Or are we just a collection of masks we wear, depending on the situation?
Well, it's not quite that simple. The book uses this really interesting example from Sartre, the existentialist philosopher.
Being and nothingness, right?
Yeah.
Big fan.
Well, he describes this waiter, right? And the waiter's meticulously performing waiterness. Every gesture, every word perfectly crafted to embody that role. Like he's hyper aware of his audience, the cafe patrons, and playing the part to a T.
But is he being genuine? Or is it all just for show? And what does that say about the rest of us just going about our daily lives? Are we all just, waiters on the stage of life, so to speak.
It's a good question, and that's where Irving Goffman comes in with his theory of impression management.
Okay, yeah, Goffman. I think I've come across his work before.
He argues that to some extent, yeah, we're all managing the impressions we give off, using our roles to shape how others see us. It's like we're all actors on a stage with costumes, scripts.
And props. And hopefully most of us are using a regular tray instead of, say, a unicycle to deliver those metaphorical bagels of selfhood.
Right. The point is, it's all about playing the part convincingly within that given social context. But to understand how this actually plays out in the real world, the book takes us from that Parisian cafe to a Norwegian fishing trawler.
From Parisian cafes to the high seas, I love it. So tell me, what does a fishing trawler reveal about impression management? And what about those bagels? Did they make it onto the boat?
Well, sadly, no bagels on this metaphorical sea voyage. But we do get a fascinating look at how these roles play out in a very different context. Frederick Barth, an anthropologist, he studied these fishermen, and he observed this fascinating phenomenon of over-communication when it came to their roles.
Over-communication. So they weren't just playing their parts, they were practically shouting their lines from the crow's nest.
In a way, yes. You see, on the trawler, you had the captain, the fisherman, and the net boss, each with their specific duties. And they would almost exaggerate certain aspects of their roles to make sure everyone knew their place in the hierarchy.
Okay, give me an example. Paint me a picture. What did this over-communication look like on this fishing boat in the middle of the ocean?
All right, picture this. You've got the captain, right? Weathered face, years of experience etched into his features. He's constantly emphasizing his judgment, his knowledge of the sea, like he's practically emanating seafaring wisdom.
He's the salty sea dog every captain dreams of being.
Exactly. He needs everyone on board to know he's the one in charge, the one calling the shots. Then you've got the fishermen, gathered on deck, intensely observing the water, speaking in hushed tones about their hopes for a good catch, playing up their eagerness, dedication, showing they're invested in the success of the voyage.
I can practically smell the salt air and feel the tension of a good catch. So what about the net boss? Was he down there channeling Poseidon, the god of the sea?
Well, not quite Poseidon, but he definitely played up his intuition, acting as if he had some sort of sixth sense about where the fish were hiding.
So they were all putting on a show, in a way, exaggerating certain aspects of their personalities to fit the script of their assigned roles.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of impression management in action. It's about maintaining order, achieving a common goal. But as Goffman points out, this doesn't necessarily mean that social life is just one big act.
No, so there's hope for us yet. We're not all just robots programmed by societal norms.
Not at all. Even when we're expressing genuine emotions, we're still operating within the framework of cultural rules,
So even our most authentic selves are filtered through a cultural lens.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, where does that leave room for individual expression?
That's a great question, and it's something anthropologists are still debating. But I think it's important to remember that culture isn't static. It's constantly evolving, influenced by the individuals within it.
Okay, so there's hope. We're not just puppets, right? There's room for agency, for shaping the very cultures that shape us. But there's another layer to this whole discussion, isn't there? Something we can't ignore.
You got it. Power dynamics. Traditional role theory, it often overlooks the very real power dynamics at play in these social interactions.
That makes sense. Not all roles are created equal, are they? Like the captain of that fishing trawler, he's got a lot more power than the deckhand, even if they're both playing their parts.
Exactly, and that's where things get really interesting.
So where were we? Ah, yes. Power dynamics. It's not just about playing a role, but about who has the power to define those roles in the first place.
Exactly. The book talks about two main perspectives on power. The first is this actor-centric view. It's like Max Weber's approach, sees power as the ability to directly influence other people's actions.
So like the captain steering the ship, he
Right.
makes the decisions that impact everyone on board.
Precisely. But then there's the second perspective, the systemic view, which is more in line with Marxist thinking. It's a bit more complex. It sees power as something embedded in the very fabric of society itself.
So it's less about the captain calling the shots and more about the fact that the ship itself, the whole system, was designed with a hierarchy in mind.
Exactly. And we don't get to choose where we're born into that hierarchy, do we? Our starting positions, whether it's poverty or privilege, they have a huge impact on our lives, on the roles we end up playing. That's systemic power.
It makes you wonder, if who we are is shaped by this web of social roles, cultural norms, power dynamics. Is there even such a thing as a true self?
Ah, the age-old question. And here's where the book really challenges our assumptions. It dives into how different cultures have completely different ideas about the self.
Right, because here in the West, we tend to have this very individualistic view, right? It's all about you do you and forging your own path. But I'm guessing that's not a universal concept.
Not at all. Many non-Western cultures have a more sociocentric view, where the self is defined by its relationships to others, to the community, to the natural world. The book mentions, for example, Melanesian societies. Personhood is something you gradually acquire through social engagement.
So you're not a fully formed you until you're part of the community.
Exactly. And in some Central African societies, children who die young, they're not considered full ancestors because they haven't had enough social experiences to solidify their personhood.
Wow. That's a very different way of thinking about death and even the afterlife, all viewed through this cultural lens.
Right. It highlights how diverse our conceptions of selfhood can be. And to illustrate this even further, the book contrasts different cultures' naming practices.
Names. Okay, I'm intrigued. How do names reflect these different views of self?
Well, take the Kuna people of Central America. They don't actually give their children proper names until they're around 10 years old.
10 years old, wow.
It's a gradual process that reflects their belief that personhood develops over time through interactions and experiences.
That's such a contrast to what we do in many Western cultures, where we name babies before they're even born.
Yeah.
But it makes sense, right? Our whole concept of selfhood, it really is a product of our cultural upbringing. And it makes you think, in our increasingly globalized digital world, those lines are getting even blurrier.
Oh, absolutely. It's fascinating how this age-old question, who am I, it's being reshaped by globalization and technology. We're constantly interacting with different cultures online, and social media adds this whole other layer to impression management.
It's Goffman's theory on steroids, right? We're crafting these online personas, curating digital selves for a global audience.
Exactly. It's fascinating, isn't it? And it makes you wonder how this constant performance, this awareness of an online audience, how's it impacting our sense of self, both online and offline?
Big questions and no easy answers. But even with all this social noise, I think there's still that inner self, that private part of us that observes it all.
Absolutely. That inner experience, even if it's not always visible to others, it's still deeply shaped by our culture. Think about it. The language we use, the values we hold, the stories we tell ourselves, it all provides the framework for how we understand our own thoughts and emotions.
So even our internal monologues have a kind of cultural accent. We're back to that software analogy. But now, it's not just shaping our outward behavior, it's shaping our innermost thoughts and feelings.
Exactly. And this raises fascinating questions about what parts of human experience are universal and what parts are culturally shaped. Are there emotions that go beyond cultural boundaries, or are we all at our core products of our cultural programming?
It really makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about yourself. This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to chew on.
Right. It's a good reminder that understanding the self is a journey, not a destination. As we encounter new cultures, new ideas, new ways of being, our sense of self evolves.
So where do we go from here? What can we do with this new awareness? How can we actually apply this knowledge about the socially constructed self?
I think the most important takeaway is to approach ourselves and others with curiosity and empathy, to recognize that our perceptions, values, even our very definition of what it means to be human, it's all shaped by this complex interplay of forces.
It's a call to look beyond the surface, to appreciate the cultural tapestry that makes each of us unique, and to remember that even in our differences, there's a shared humanity that connects us all.
Well said. And maybe it's also about asking ourselves, what role do we want to play in all of this? What kind of self do we want to bring to the stage, both in our own cultures and on the global stage we now all share?
It's a question worth pondering. So as we navigate this complex dance between the individual and society, let's do it with curiosity, compassion, and a sense of wonder. And maybe a bagel or two along the way for good measure.